When the meteor crashed into the dense Amazon rainforest, most people barely noticed. A few astronomers speculated about its origin, but no one could have predicted the horror it would bring. The impact site was remote, hidden deep within the uncharted green abyss. The first ones to find it were local tribespeople, their curiosity leading them to something beyond their worst nightmares. The meteor wasn't just a rock, it was a carrier, a silent, invisible invader. The virus spread with the wind, slipping into the lungs of the unsuspecting, spreading without mercy. It had no name at first. It was just a fever, a cough, a strange dizziness. But within days, people began to change. Dr. Ethan Cross, a virologist working with the World Health Organization, first heard about the mysterious sickness when reports surfaced of strange deaths in the Amazon. People weren't just dying, they were transforming. Their skin hardened like stone, their eyes turned a sickly silver, and worst of all, they became something else entirely, something no longer human. The world was unprepared. By the time anyone understood what was happening, the virus had already reached the cities. And what humanity didn't know was that the real horror was yet to come. The falling star, the night sky over the Amazon rainforest was unusually clear. The dense, humid air carried the distant calls of nocturnal creatures, blending into a symphony of the wild. The jungle, ancient and mysterious, stood undisturbed until the heavens tore open. A streak of fire cut across the sky, its brilliance momentarily turning night into day. It moved with terrifying speed, a roaring inferno plummeting towards the earth. Trees shook violently as a deafening explosion shattered the peace. A shockwave rippled through the rainforest, sending flocks of birds screeching into the air. Deep within the jungle, where no roads led and no maps existed, the meteor had carved a burning scar into the land. Trees lay flattened in concentric rings around a deep crater, smoke rising from the wound in the earth. The object at its center pulsed with an eerie, faint blue glow. It was no ordinary rock. The first witnesses, the Ashaninka tribe, who had lived in harmony with the rainforest for generations, were the first to notice the disturbance. Their village, a small collection of wooden huts nestled between towering trees, was miles from the crash site, but they felt the tremors in their bones. Elder Nahan, a man with deep lines etched into his weathered face, gathered the bravest of his people. He had seen many things in his lifetime, but never had the sky fallen upon their sacred land. With torches in hand, the group moved through the jungle, following the acrid scent of burning earth. When they reached the crater, an uneasy silence settled over them. The air shimmered with heat, carrying an odd metallic scent. The trees at the edge of the impact zone had been stripped bare, their leaves reduced to ash. Nahan stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the glowing meteor. A young warrior, Tupac, knelt beside it, his fingers hovering just above its surface. "It breathes," he murmured. Indeed, the strange rock seemed to pulse as if something within it was alive. Then came the whisper. At first it was only a feeling, a presence creeping into their minds like a shadow stretching at dusk. It was not a voice, not in the way humans spoke, but an impression, a silent call that beckoned them closer. Tupac, entranced, reached out and pressed his palm against the rock. A sharp hiss filled the air, and his body stiffened. His breathing quickened, his skin breaking out in sweat. The others pulled him away, but it was too late. The meteor had woken. A sickness unseen the following morning, Tupac awoke with feverish eyes. His body burned, his muscles spasmed, and his veins darkened beneath his skin. The village healer did all she could, but nothing soothed him. Soon, others began to fall ill, those who had been closest to the crater. By the third day, the first death occurred. Tupac's body hardened unnaturally, his skin taking on a grayish sheen. His breath slowed until it stopped entirely. His family wept, unaware of the horror that was yet to come. That night, when the moon hung high above the trees, Tupac's eyes snapped open. They glowed silver. He rose, his movements unnatural and stiff. His head tilted as though listening to something only he could hear. Then, without warning, he turned on his own people. The screams shattered the night. The call for help thousands of miles away, in the bustling city of Sao Paulo, Dr. Ethan Cross sat in his cluttered office, staring at his computer screen. A world-renowned virologist, Ethan had spent years studying emerging diseases, but nothing had prepared him for the report he was reading. An unknown sickness had surfaced in the Amazon. Fever, rapid tissue hardening, neurological changes. Symptoms that didn't match any known virus. What disturbed Ethan most were the final lines of the report. Victims display erratic, and aggressive behavior. Early autopsies suggest an unknown biological agent. Ethan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. If these reports were true, this wasn't just a disease. It was something worse. Within hours, he was on a plane to Brazil's capital, where the World Health Organization was assembling a team. The Brazilian government had already sent military personnel into the jungle, but they had lost contact with their units. Panic was beginning to spread. Ethan knew they were running out of time. Into the unknown, the expedition team, a mix of scientists and soldiers, boarded a military helicopter bound for the last known location of the infected village. As they flew deeper into the Amazon, Ethan looked down at the endless green stretching below. "Ever been to the jungle before, Doc?" one of the soldiers asked, smirking. Ethan shook his head. "No, but I have a feeling this isn't going to be a normal visit." The soldier's grin faded. No one truly knew what awaited them. As the helicopter neared the crash site, the pilot's voice crackled through the radio. "We've got a problem. Smoke up ahead." Ethan leaned forward, peering through the window. Thick black plumes rose from the trees. Something had burned, and recently. Moments later, the helicopter hovered over what remained of the village. The sight below sent chills down Ethan's spine. The village was in ruins. Huts had been torn apart, their wooden frames shattered. The bodies of the dead lay scattered, twisted unnaturally, their faces frozen in terror. The only movement came from the jungle itself, as if the forest was reclaiming what had been lost. Then Ethan saw them. Figures stood motionless among the trees, their bodies unnaturally still. Their skin, hardened and gray, reflected the sunlight like polished stone. Their silver eyes locked onto the helicopter. Then, all at once, they moved. The radio burst to life with the pilot's frantic voice. "They're coming." Ethan's stomach clenched. Whatever this virus was, it wasn't just killing people. It was creating something else. Patient Zero, the smell of death, clung to the village like a thick fog. Smoke still curled from the charred remains of huts, their skeletal frames barely standing. Crows circled overhead, their sharp cries piercing the heavy silence. The ground was littered with bodies, some burned beyond recognition, others twisted in agony, their skin a strange, hardened gray. Dr. Ethan Cross stepped cautiously onto the soil, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. The air was humid, thick with the scent of decay and something else, something metallic and unnatural. His heart pounded as he adjusted his respirator. He had seen viral outbreaks before, but this was different. "Stay alert," warned Captain Ramirez, the Brazilian Special Forces leader accompanying the team. His rifle was raised, eyes scanning the tree line. Ethan turned to his colleague, Dr. Ana Vasquez, a microbiologist specializing in exotic pathogens. "We need a sample," he said. "If we don't figure out what this is, we won't stand a chance of stopping it." Let's start with the bodies. The first transformation, the team moved cautiously toward the center of the village, where the bodies were more concentrated. Ethan knelt beside one of the corpses, a man, mid-30s, his eyes wide open, frozen in an expression of terror. His skin had taken on the same unnatural sheen as the others. Ethan reached into his medical kit and removed a scalpel. With a deep breath, he made a small incision in the man's arm. The skin didn't react like human flesh. It was firm, almost like stone, yet flexible underneath. Instead of blood, a thick, dark fluid oozed from the wound. It had an iridescent shimmer, shifting colors under the light. "What the hell?" Anna whispered. Then the corpse moved. A sharp gasp escaped Ethan as the body jerked violently, its fingers twitched. Its silver eyes rolled, unfocused at first. Then they locked onto him. "Fall back!" Ramirez shouted, raising his weapon. The corpse convulsed, its back arching unnaturally before it sprang to its feet in one fluid motion. It stood there, swaying slightly, as if struggling to orient itself. Then, with terrifying speed, it lunged. Ramirez fired, the bullet tearing through the infected man's shoulder. A normal human would have fallen, but this thing barely flinched. Anna screamed as she stumbled backward. Ethan grabbed her arm, pulling her away as more gunshots rang out. "Ooh." The infected man snarled, his movements jerky but fast. It took 5 shots to bring him down. When he finally collapsed, his body shuddered, and a faint whisper filled the air, a sound Ethan could only describe as alien. The team stood in stunned silence. "Oh, that thing wasn't alive," Ramirez said, his face pale. "At least, not in the way we understand." Ethan's mind raced. If the virus could do this, then the world was in far greater danger than anyone realized. The spread begins by the time they return to the capital. The virus had already begun its silent march across Brazil. Reports of strange fevers and erratic behavior flooded in from nearby towns. Hospitals were filling with patients showing the early symptoms: fever, confusion, silver discoloration in the eyes. But it wasn't just in Brazil. Similar cases were being reported in Colombia, Peru, and Venezuela. The virus was spreading, and fast. Ethan and Anna worked around the clock in a government lab, analyzing the blood samples taken from the village. What they found was horrifying. "This isn't a virus," Anna whispered, staring at the microscope. "At least, not like anything we've seen before." Ethan peered into the lens. What he saw chilled him to the bone. The virus wasn't just replicating, it was changing human DNA, rewriting it at a terrifying speed. It wasn't killing people, it was converting them. "This isn't natural," Ethan muttered. "This was made." Anna looked at him, her face pale. "Do you think this was intentional?" Before he could answer, the lab door burst open. A government official stormed in, flanked by 2 armed guards. "You're done here," the man said coldly. "All research is now classified." Ethan's blood ran cold. "You can't cover this up." "We need to warn people." The official stepped closer, lowering his voice. "No, doctor, you need to understand. This is only the beginning. The silver-eyed ones the world was beginning to crack. Hospitals overflowed with the infected. Entire towns fell silent overnight, their streets littered with empty cars and abandoned belongings. Where there had once been bustling markets and human voices, now there was only an eerie, unnatural stillness. And the silver-eyed ones were watching. "Doctor." Ethan Cross stood in the dimly lit research lab, his fingers tightening around the microscope's edges. His mind struggled to process what he was seeing. The virus, if it could still be called that, was no longer just a disease. It was something far more terrifying. Under magnification, the infected blood cells shimmered with a metallic sheen, pulsing as if alive. But the most disturbing part? They were communicating. "This shouldn't be possible," Dr. Ana Vasquez whispered beside him, her voice barely above a breath. A breath. She pointed at the monitor displaying the virus's behavior. The cells weren't just multiplying, they were aligning, forming patterns, almost like a network. Ethan ran a hand through his unkempt hair, his heart pounding. "It's evolving." A sudden explosion in the distance shook the building, rattling the glass vials on the table. Ethan and Anna exchanged a panicked glance before rushing to the window. The city outside was no longer the city they had known. The Hive awakens down on the streets, soldiers lined up in a desperate attempt to hold the quarantine zone. Spotlights illuminated the perimeter as barricades of sandbags and barbed wire stood as the last defense between humanity and the infected. But it wouldn't hold. The silver-eyed ones moved through the streets with an unnatural fluidity, their limbs twitching as though controlled by invisible strings. Some ran, others crawled, their bodies bending at inhuman angles. And worst of all, they moved together. "What the hell are they doing?" One of the soldiers muttered, gripping his rifle tighter. Then, as if commanded by an unseen force, the infected stopped. Hundreds of them stood still in eerie synchronization, their heads tilted in unison, listening. Then they charged. Gunfire erupted. Bullets tore through the infected, but they didn't react like normal humans. They didn't scream. They didn't slow down. Some fell, but others leapt over the bodies with terrifying speed. Their glowing silver eyes locked onto their prey. The front line collapsed in seconds. Screams filled the air as soldiers were dragged down, their cries cut short by snapping bones and tearing flesh. One soldier managed to throw a grenade before being overwhelmed. The explosion sent bodies flying, but as the smoke cleared, Ethan saw something that made his blood run cold. The infected, those still standing, didn't scatter. They simply adjusted, shifting positions as if they were a single entity. "Oh my God," Anna whispered. "Oh, they're a hive." Ethan clenched his fists. The virus wasn't just turning people into monsters. It was linking them, creating something far worse than a mindless plague. It was building an army. A failing containment, the government's response was swift but hopeless. Martial law was declared. Cities were sealed off. Military outposts were fortified. But none of it mattered. The silver-eyed ones weren't acting like mindless zombies. They learned. They adapted. They waited. Infected individuals had begun showing increased intelligence, setting traps, ambushing survivors, even communicating without words. Some victims, moments before turning, reported hearing whispers in their minds, as if something was calling to them from beyond. Ethan sat in the darkened lab, staring at the data before him. His fingers hovered over his laptop's keyboard, hesitating. He had compiled everything: the rate of mutation, the hive-like behavior, the terrifying reality that this virus was not just spreading, it was planning. A knock at the door startled him. Ramirez entered, his face grim. "Doc, we have a problem." Ethan didn't need to ask. He already knew. The silver-eyed ones were no longer just in the quarantine zones. They were everywhere. The world was burning. Ethan Cross sat hunched over his laptop in the dimly lit laboratory, the glow of the screen casting shadows across his exhausted face. The data confirmed his worst fears. The virus wasn't just adapting, it was preparing. Every recorded mutation pointed toward a terrifying conclusion. This wasn't a natural outbreak, it was engineered. Outside, Sao Paulo had become a war zone. Fires raged uncontrollably, smoke billowing into the darkened sky. The once bustling streets were now battlegrounds littered with abandoned vehicles, shattered glass, and the bodies of those who had lost the fight. Screams echoed in the distance, blending with sporadic gunfire. Desperate last stands against an enemy that never tired, never stopped. The silver-eyed ones moved like shadows through the chaos, relentless and coordinated. There was no reasoning with them, no bargaining. They were part of something greater, something connected, and humanity was losing. Collapse of civilization, the fall happened faster than anyone had predicted. Major cities across the world, New York, London, Tokyo, had gone dark. Governments scrambled to maintain control, but within days, most leadership had vanished. Emergency broadcasts looped the same desperate message: seek shelter, avoid infection. Do not engage the infected. But there were no shelters, no safe havens. The roads were choked with panicked survivors trying to escape, their vehicles crawling through the gridlocked streets, but it was all in vain. The infected didn't need to rush. They just waited. And when the time came, they descended upon the highways like a tidal wave, turning fleeing civilians into more of their own. Ethan and his team had no choice. They had to leave. Desperate flight, we have to move now. Captain Ramirez barked, shoving supplies into a backpack. The military's pulling out. We stay, we die. Dr. Ana Vasquez clutched a hard drive to her chest, her face pale. But what about the research? We need to... There won't be any research if we're dead, Ethan cut in. His voice was steady, but his hands trembled as he packed his notes. Outside, the infected were coming. Their eerie silver eyes glowed in the flickering firelight, their bodies moving with a nightmarish grace. Some crawled along the sides of buildings, others perched motionless on rooftops, heads tilting in unison as if listening. Then, all at once, they moved. Ramirez fired the first shot, dropping an infected woman who had been sprinting toward them. Go! Go! The group tore through the shattered remains of the laboratory, emerging into the chaotic streets. A helicopter roared overhead, its searchlight cutting through the smoke. Survivors scrambled toward it, waving, screaming. Then the infected swarmed. They came from all directions, bursting through windows, climbing over cars, leaping onto the fleeing survivors. The helicopter pilot hesitated, unsure whether to land. That hesitation was fatal. From a nearby rooftop, an infected man launched himself into the open cockpit. The chopper veered wildly before slamming into a skyscraper, erupting into a fireball. Ethan didn't stop running. The truth in the shadows hours later, they had made it to the outskirts of the city, finding temporary refuge in an abandoned radio tower. The sounds of carnage had faded into the distance, replaced by an oppressive silence. Ethan sat against the wall, exhausted. He pulled out his laptop, praying that the satellite connection still worked. When the screen flickered to life, he saw an unread message in his inbox. It had no sender, no subject, just a single line of text. You were never meant to find it. Ethan's blood ran cold. Before he could respond, another message appeared. We are watching. If you want to live, follow the signal. A set of coordinates flashed on the screen. Ethan turned to Anna, his voice barely above a whisper. Above a whisper. Someone out there knows the truth. Ramirez checked his rifle. Then we better find them before the silver-eyed ones do. Outside, the moon hung low over the ruined city, and in the shadows, the infected were still watching. The hidden war, the journey to the coordinates, wasn't easy. Ethan Cross sat in the back of an old military jeep, gripping the rusted metal frame as the vehicle bounced violently over the cracked road. The world outside was a graveyard. Burned-out cars, collapsed buildings, and bodies that lay untouched, their silver-eyed transformation frozen in death. Ana Vasquez sat beside him, her fingers wrapped tightly around the hard drive containing their research. Across from them, Captain Ramirez checked his rifle, his jaw set in grim determination. Their group had shrunk. Only 7 survivors remained from the dozens who had once fled the city together. The rest had been lost to the infected, or worse. The rogue human factions had become just as dangerous as the silver-eyed ones. The jeep slowed as they approached their destination, a hidden military bunker deep in the jungle, a relic from the Cold War era. According to the message Ethan had received, this place held the answers they needed. The truth about the virus, but as the vehicle rolled to a stop, an uneasy silence filled the air. "Something's not right," Ramirez muttered, stepping out first, his weapon raised. The bunker's entrance was partially hidden beneath layers of overgrown vines and foliage. It should have been abandoned. But the heavy steel doors were open, and the smell of blood hung in the air. The bunker's secrets, Ramirez signaled for the others to stay close as they moved inside. The hallway beyond was dimly lit by flickering emergency lights, casting long, jagged shadows against the walls. The metallic scent of blood grew stronger with every step. Bodies were scattered throughout the corridor, military personnel in black tactical gear, their throats torn open, their faces frozen in terror. Bullet holes lined the walls, suggesting a firefight, but there were no shell casings. No sign of an enemy. Ethan's stomach twisted. They didn't even have time to reload. Ana swallowed hard. Then what killed them? A sudden noise echoed through the bunker. A metallic clang followed by a distant guttural whisper. The survivors froze. Ramirez gestured for them to move forward, and they did, slowly, cautiously. The deeper they went, the more obvious it became that something had gone wrong in this facility long before they arrived. Then they reached the control room. The massive monitors lining the walls flickered with corrupted data, static filling the air, but on the central screen, a single message remained intact. Project Requiem, Phase 3 initiated. External transmission successful. Ethan's eyes darted to the decrypted files on one of the still-active computers. His breath caught in his throat as he read the words aloud. The virus. It wasn't an accident. His voice shook. It was sent here. Anna's face went pale. By who? Before Ethan could answer, the speakers crackled to life. A distorted voice, neither entirely human nor fully mechanical, whispered through the static. "You were not supposed to survive." Then the lights cut out. The enemy in the shadows of the room plunged into darkness, broken only by the eerie glow of their flashlight beams. Then came the sound, skittering. Something was in the vents. "A move! Now!" Ramirez shouted, pushing the others toward the exit. The survivors bolted through the darkened corridors, their footsteps echoing as the sound of metal screeching against metal filled the air. Whatever was in those vents wasn't human. Then the first one dropped from the ceiling. It landed on one of the survivors, a man named Blake. He barely had time to scream before the creature's elongated fingers wrapped around his head, twisting with a sickening snap. His body crumpled to the floor. Ethan barely got a glimpse of it, a humanoid shape, unnaturally thin, its skin stretched too tight over its bones. Its silver eyes gleamed in the darkness as it watched them. Not mindless, not just infected, something else. They fired. The creature screeched as the bullets tore into it, but it didn't go down easily. It took half a magazine before it finally collapsed. More movement. "A run!" Ramirez barked. They sprinted down the final corridor, pushing through the bunker doors and into the humid jungle air. Behind them in the darkness, the silver-eyed creatures didn't pursue. They simply stood there, watching. A war long before us back at their temporary hideout. Ethan sat staring at the stolen data, his hands trembling. "These creatures, they were here before the outbreak," he whispered. The virus didn't create them. It woke them up. Anna exhaled sharply. "Which means—" Ethan met her gaze, his voice hollow. "This was never just an infection. It's an invasion." Silence filled the room as the weight of the revelation settled over them. The virus wasn't just designed to spread. It was designed to prepare the Earth for something much worse. And whatever had sent it was coming. The world was on the brink of annihilation. Ethan sat hunched over a cluttered desk in the makeshift lab, his tired eyes scanning the screens filled with data. His fingers moved mechanically, typing in calculations that didn't quite seem to make sense. Not anymore. The virus, now fully integrated into its hive mind, was evolving at a pace that no one had anticipated. The infected had long stopped being individuals. They had become a unified force, a collective intelligence that shared a singular, terrifying purpose. The world outside was in chaos. Governments had failed. Entire cities had fallen, and the infected continued to spread, their silver eyes watching from every shadow. But now, something new was happening, something more terrifying. They weren't just consuming humanity. They were preparing for an invasion of some kind, as if they were waiting for a signal. The question was, for what? Ana Vasquez entered the room, her face grim. "Ethan, we need to talk." He looked up from the screen, his brow furrowed. "I know, it's all falling apart." His voice was heavy with a mixture of exhaustion and resignation. "There's more," Ana said softly. "The infected, they're moving like a single organism. The hive mind is growing stronger. It's not just about survival anymore. They're building something, gathering strength for an assault." Ethan ran a hand through his hair. "We have to stop it." The room fell into silence, the weight of the statement hanging in the air. But Anna's next words broke the tension. "We can't stop it by just hiding. Ethan, it's time to make a choice. Fight or flee. We can't run forever." His mind raced. The data he'd uncovered suggested a possible cure, an experimental antidote derived from the virus itself. It was risky, even borderline insane. The cure would require injecting the uninfected with a specially altered version of the virus to trigger an immune response, but there was no guarantee it would work. "We fight," Ethan said, his voice steady but resolute. "There's a chance, a small one, but if we don't try, we're all dead anyway." Ramirez, who had been silent in the corner, finally spoke up. "It's not just the infected we have to worry about. We have rogue human factions, militias that have turned on each other. If we try to make a move, we'll have to contend with them too. It's not just a war with the infected anymore. It's a war with ourselves." The survivors gathered around, each wearing expressions of fear, determination, and hopelessness in equal measure. Ethan's eyes moved from one to the other. He had seen too many people lose their lives, too many friends fall to the infected, or the madness that had gripped the world. "I don't know if we can win this," Anna whispered, her voice breaking. "But I do know one thing. We can't just let it end without a fight." Outside, the infected began to gather. They were everywhere, moving like a swarm of locusts, methodical and unwavering. Their silver eyes glinted in the fading light, their movements synchronized, and with each passing moment, they grew stronger. It was as if they could sense the decision humanity was about to make. Ethan stood up, his resolve hardening. "We don't have a choice anymore. This is it. We either take the fight to them, or we let them wipe us out." The survivors nodded, each of them understanding the gravity of the situation. The world watched, every remaining free human knowing this was the last stand, the final chance for survival. The battle begins the night before the assault was a quiet one, filled with uncertainty. Some of the survivors spent it preparing, others sat in silence, each one struggling with their own personal demons. Ethan found himself staring out into the darkened sky, the distant fires from the last remnants of civilization glowing faintly on the horizon. It felt like the end of the world, because it might very well be. Anna joined him by the window, standing silently by his side. "Are we doing the right thing?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He had no clear answer, but he finally said, "I don't know, but it's the only thing we can do." She sighed, her breath soft against the cool night air. "Then we make it count." As dawn broke, the survivors prepared for the final confrontation. The group split into two, one to draw the infected away from the bunker, the other to infiltrate their command center and administer the experimental cure. With hearts pounding, weapons loaded, and fear hanging thick in the air, the survivors stepped out into the open. The infected were already waiting, their silver eyes gleaming in the morning light. It was time. The first rays of the sun broke through the smoke-filled sky, casting a blood-red glow over the barren landscape. The world, as it had been known, was gone. Humanity stood on the edge of extinction, and the final battle was about to begin. Ethan Cross stood at the front of the makeshift army, his eyes scanning the field of infected before him. Their silver eyes gleamed in unison, their movements synchronized as they slowly approached. It was as if they were waiting for something, waiting for the inevitable clash. The air was thick with tension, and every breath felt like it could be their last. Behind him, the rest of the survivors were preparing, their faces hardened by weeks of terror. Ramirez checked his rifle once more. Anna adjusted the hard drive in her pack, and the others took their positions, each person carrying the weight of humanity's fate on their shoulders. "This is it," Ramirez said, his voice quiet but resolute. "We go in hard. We hit them with everything we've got." Ethan turned to Anna, his hand trembling as he gripped the syringe containing the experimental cure. He had one shot at this, one chance to save what was left of humanity, but the question still gnawed at him. Should he release the cure and hope it would work? Or was there another, more drastic approach that could end the nightmare once and for all? "I don't know if this is the right thing to do," Ethan said, his voice heavy with doubt. "What if the cure doesn't work? What if it makes them stronger?" Anna placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "Ethan, you've done everything you can. You can't predict what will happen, but you can act. This is our best shot." Before Ethan could respond, a sudden noise cut through the silence. A low, eerie hum that seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath them. The infected had begun to move, slowly, deliberately. Their numbers were overwhelming. And then, from the back of their ranks, something unexpected happened. A group of survivors emerged, limping out from the shadows of the ruined buildings. They were ragged and bruised, their clothes torn, their faces gaunt with hunger and fear. But what struck Ethan the most were their eyes. They didn't have the silver glow of the infected. They were human. "What the hell?" Ramirez muttered under his breath. The survivors approached slowly. Their leader, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a weathered face, stepped forward. He held up his hands, signaling peace. "We're not your enemies," the man said, his voice hoarse. "We were once part of the infected, volunteers in an experiment." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "You were immune," the man nodded. "Not immune, aware. We were part of a covert project long before the virus ever reached Earth. Our purpose was to survive, adapt, and bring the virus to its next stage. But we didn't know the full scope of it. We were misled." Anna's eyes widened in shock. The virus was engineered, but it wasn't just a weapon. It was a tool. "Exactly," the man said, his voice filled with regret. "The virus was meant to create a new type of organism. A new species, something beyond human. But the real purpose, what we didn't realize, was that the virus was designed to merge the minds of the infected, to create something greater than us. It was never meant to destroy. It was meant to evolve." Ethan's mind raced. He'd thought the infected were mindless creatures, simple, unstoppable. But they weren't. They were part of a plan, a grand experiment in evolution. The true goal of the virus was to forge a new kind of intelligence, a superhuman, hive-minded species. "But if you're immune, why didn't you stop it?" Anna asked, her voice sharp. "We tried," the man said bitterly. "But we were controlled, manipulated by those who sent the virus here. We weren't given all the information. We were just tools, playing our parts in a much larger game. Now it's out of our hands, but we can still help." Ethan stared at him, his mind spinning. Could they trust these people? Were they just another faction trying to take control, or were they the key to humanity's survival? "We need to act fast," the man continued. "The virus is on the brink of its final stage. If you release that cure, it might stop them for a time, but it won't end it. We have one shot left to prevent what's coming." Ethan's gaze locked onto the syringe in his hand. His fingers tightened around the glass, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He had to choose. Release the cure and risk everything, or take the extreme measure of ending it once and for all, wiping out the infected and their hive mind for good. Without warning, the infected surged forward, their movements now faster, more coordinated. The final battle had begun. "Release the cure. B," Ethan shouted, making his decision. But before he could inject the solution into the air, the ground shook violently beneath them. A massive, towering figure, an evolved form of the infected, emerged from the center of the hive. Its body pulsed with energy, and its silver eyes burned with unnatural intelligence. It was no longer just a virus. It had become a weapon of mass destruction. The survivors moved into position, ready to fight for their lives and for humanity's future. As Ethan looked up at the towering monstrosity before them, a new dawn was indeed rising, but it wasn't a dawn of hope. It was a dawn of uncertainty. The world would never be the same again. The final battle raged on for what felt like an eternity. The world, broken and battered, lay at the feet of its last defenders. The air was thick with smoke, and the earth trembled beneath the force of the clash between humanity's survivors and the evolved, hive-minded infected. Ethan Cross, his heart racing, stood at the center of the chaos, the cure still clutched tightly in his hand. His fingers burned with the weight of the decision he had made. This was it, the moment of truth. Would the cure stop the swarm? Would it restore humanity? Or had the world already passed the point of no return? The evolved infected, larger, faster, more intelligent, advanced with horrifying precision. Every move they made was calculated, as if they were part of a singular mind. And standing before them, humanity's resistance seemed like nothing more than a flicker in the dark. But the survivors didn't back down. Ramirez, Anna, and the others fought with everything they had, pushing forward with a courage born of desperation. The battle was relentless, each moment feeling like the last. Yet, even in the midst of the chaos, Ethan felt the pull of the cure, its potential to bring an end to this nightmare. With a final determined breath, Ethan plunged the syringe into the ground, releasing the cure into the air. The surrounding infected staggered back, their bodies twitching and convulsing as the antidote took effect. For a moment, it seemed as if the tide might turn in humanity's favor. But the evolved leader, its monstrous form towering above the battlefield, shuddered and let out a deafening screech. It had adapted, absorbed the virus mutations into something more. Its intelligence surged, and it became even more dangerous. It reached for Ethan, its clawed hand aiming to crush him, to end humanity's resistance once and for all. In the final moments, a mysterious force intervened. The immune survivors, the ones who had once been manipulated by the experiment, rushed forward, using their unique connection to the virus. They fought with a purpose greater than mere survival. Their knowledge, gained through years of subjugation, allowed them to disrupt the infected's hive mind. Together they created a shockwave of psychic force that destabilized the evolved being, bringing it to its knees. But it wasn't over. The battle had only just begun. The cure had worked, but the virus was already shifting, its purpose evolving into something more complex, more insidious. The world wasn't saved yet. It was a new beginning, one filled with uncertainty. As the dust settled and the last of the infected were neutralized, the survivors looked to the horizon. The world was in ruins, but they had a choice now. Humanity had fought back, defied extinction, and reclaimed its destiny. But the questions remained. What now? Would they rebuild the Earth? Or would the legacy of the virus give birth to something else entirely? The dawn was not one of clear skies or bright hope. It was a dawn of transformation. The virus had done more than change the infected. It had changed humanity itself. And as Ethan and his companions stared into the future, they knew one thing for certain. The world would never be the same again. They had survived. But the question remained, could they thrive?